January 17, 1943. Stalingrad, 7:41 hours. The world was ice and fire. A single Panzer IV crawled through the ruins, its treads grinding the bones of the city into frost. The temperature, 30 below. The silence, absolute. In the upper floor of a bombed-out apartment, Sergeant Ivan Kravchenko lay prone behind a cracked window frame. His rifle trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the cold. The glass of his scope had begun to fog again. A crude lens he'd built himself from scavenged Zeiss binoculars, brass scrap, and truck rubber. His comrades had laughed when they saw it. A child's toy, they called it. Now, through that same crooked sight, Ivan watched the tank commander lean from his hatch. The distance, 860 meters. He adjusted windage, whispered a number to his spotter, and held his breath. The world shrank to the width of a reticle. The trigger broke like ice. One rifle shot cracked across the ruins of Stalingrad, and a German Panzer ground to a stop, smoke curling from its vision slit. In that frozen second, the laughter that had followed him for weeks vanished into silence. By the winter of 1943, the war on the Eastern Front had consumed everything: men, machines, and mercy. What began in June 1941 as Hitler's swift invasion of the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa had devolved into a grinding contest of endurance. The Wehrmacht, once confident in its blitzkrieg momentum, now faced a Soviet defense forged in desperation. Cities like Smolensk, Kiev, and Kharkov had already burned, and by late 1942, the German Sixth Army was trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad, a city reduced to dust and defiance. The city, once home to 500,000 people, had become a battlefield of brick and shadow. Tanks prowled through the skeletons of factories. Snipers ruled the streets where soldiers moved not by distance, but by inches. Every building, every crater, every frozen corpse offered concealment or death. It was in this unforgiving theater that the rifle, an old tool of the infantry, became a weapon of psychological dominance. The Red Army understood this well. With ammunition low and air support uncertain, a single shot delivered by a patient marksman could do what artillery sometimes could not: break morale. Soviet snipers became the invisible terror of the German lines. Names like Vasily Zaitsev, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, and Ivan Sidorenko were whispered among comrades and feared among enemies. Each was proof that precision, not power, could decide survival. But for every celebrated sniper, there were hundreds like Sergeant Ivan Kravchenko, whose names history barely recorded. Men who fought not with the best equipment, but with whatever they could build, scavenge, or imagine. The Red Army's supply chain, stretched thin across thousands of kilometers, could not equip every rifleman with an optical sight. Most sharpshooters fought with iron sights. Reliable, yes, but limited beyond a few hundred meters. Kravchenko was not content with that. Before the war, he had worked as a machinist in a factory outside Rostov, where he repaired optical instruments and vehicle components. When his regiment ran out of sniper scopes, he scavenged a pair of broken German Zeiss binoculars from a battlefield cache. He disassembled them, salvaged the lenses, and began to tinker. Using the brass frame from a compass and rubber cut from a destroyed truck's inner tube, he built a crude but functional scope that could magnify at roughly 3.5x. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. His fellow soldiers laughed when they saw it. "It'll fog up before it fires," one joked. Others warned him it could shatter under recoil. But Ivan was quiet, patient in both craft and character. He believed that if he could see farther, he could live longer, and perhaps take more of the enemy with him. That belief was shared by the Soviet command. The Red Army, realizing the psychological and tactical power of snipers, began to formalize sniper units and training schools. In December 1942, the Central Women's Sniper Training School had opened in Moscow, producing over 1,000 trained sharpshooters. Across the front, scavenged optics were being repurposed into rifle sights, often built from aircraft gun sights or even camera lenses. Innovation was not luxury, it was survival. In the ruins of Stalingrad, visibility was a strange kind of power. The German Panzers, designed for open-field maneuver warfare, found themselves confined among walls and rubble. A sniper could wait for hours, even days, for one precise shot at a driver's slit, a commander's hatch, or an exposed viewport. A hit there could immobilize or blind a tank without ever penetrating its armor. That was Kravchenko's obsession. Not killing the tank, but killing its vision. He had learned that if he could strike a tank's gunner through the periscope slit or shatter its optical visor, it would become blind, trapped in confusion. The rest would follow. As January 1943 dawned, temperatures in Stalingrad fell to 30 degrees. Frost formed inside rifles, scopes fogged from breath, and the dead froze where they fell. Yet through it all, the battle for vision, to see first, to shoot first, defined who lived and who didn't. And amid that silent war of optics, Kravchenko prepared to prove that what he had built with his own hands could change the balance of fear, one shot at a time. The battle for Stalingrad was more than a fight for a city. It was a duel of ideologies, fought through exhaustion and invention. By mid-January 1943, the German Sixth Army was starving, encircled, and slowly crumbling. General Friedrich Paulus's once proud force of 300,000 men was now reduced to less than half, cornered in a patch of urban ruin no larger than 10 square kilometers. Supplies came by air, barely, and every night Soviet artillery pounded the frozen earth where they huddled for warmth. The Soviets, under General Vasily Chuikov, pressed forward yard by yard. Chuikov had turned defense into art, using the terrain's wreckage to break the German line of sight. He ordered snipers to be the eyes of the Red Army. "If they cannot see," he said, "they cannot fight." In these close, fractured battles, the man with the clearer vision often outlived the man with the heavier weapon. For Ivan Kravchenko, vision had become everything. The homemade scope on his rifle wasn't just a piece of glass and brass, it was the difference between life and death. Yet it came with flaws. The lens alignment was imperfect, and in freezing temperatures, condensation gathered between its crude seals. Each time he fired, he had to recalibrate using marks etched into the side of the barrel with a bayonet. But even with its faults, the scope extended his effective range beyond 800 meters, a distance few on either side dared to attempt in such ruinous terrain. The makeshift sniper posts of Stalingrad were nothing more than holes in walls, window frames stuffed with cloth, or gaps between fallen beams. Kravchenko often positioned himself inside collapsed apartment blocks, where snow filtered through the ceiling and corpses lay frozen around him. The Germans had grown cautious, knowing that even the smallest movement, a reflection, a sound, could draw a bullet. By this stage, the Panzers had become both symbols of power and targets of vulnerability. Soviet infantry could not always destroy them with small arms, but they could wound them, blind them. A tank with its optics shattered was a steel coffin. It could no longer aim, advance, or retreat effectively. Soviet snipers had learned this from bitter experience, turning their fire from men to machinery. The Germans called it Nervenkrieg, a war of nerves. Across the river, in Moscow and Leningrad, factories were rushing to produce more PU scopes for the Mosin Nagant 9130 sniper rifles. But frontline units like Kravchenko's couldn't wait for deliveries. The Red Army encouraged field improvisation. Engineers and mechanics were authorized to modify weapons with whatever tools were available. In one infamous instance, A sniper attached a camera lens to a rifle mount using welding wire and electrical tape, and achieved confirmed kills at over 500 meters. The line between craftsmanship and survival blurred completely. Within this environment of brutal pragmatism, Kravchenko's tinkering didn't seem so outlandish anymore. What began as a joke among comrades started to draw attention when his shots consistently found targets the others could barely see. Reports of a sniper with the homemade sight began circulating up the chain of command. The weapon itself became a curiosity. Soldiers from nearby units came to see it, tapping the lens housing, inspecting the alignment, laughing nervously before returning to their own corners of the front. Meanwhile, the enemy was unraveling. German tank crews, once confident in their armor, were now haunted by the unseen enemy, who could strike their viewports with surgical precision. The shattered glass of periscopes littered the streets. Even when the shot didn't kill, it instilled paralysis, a hesitation to move forward, to expose a hatch, to trust that the tank could see what it was supposed to destroy. In the last weeks of the Stalingrad siege, survival was reduced to a simple equation. Whoever saw first lived longer. Kravchenko's handmade scope wasn't a miracle weapon. It was a symbol of adaptation, of the Soviet soldier's ability to fight not just with strength, but with imagination. And as the snow thickened around the ruins of the Red October factory and the Volga froze over in white silence, Ivan waited behind his rifle once more, ready to test, in one perfect shot, whether invention could triumph over industrial might. War strips men down to their essentials: fear, instinct, and faith in whatever keeps them alive. For Sergeant Ivan Kravchenko, faith took the shape of a handmade scope bound together with glue and brass wire. He wasn't a famous marksman or a propaganda hero. He was one of tens of thousands of soldiers drawn from factories, farms, and rail yards, thrust into the largest slaughterhouse on earth. What set Ivan apart wasn't bravery. It was belief in his hands. A machinist's eye sees precision where others see scrap. Where soldiers saw rubble, he saw material. Lenses, tubing, fragments of steel and glass. In a city built on industry and reduced to ruin, he rebuilt a fragment of order. Something that could still function, still make sense. He knew his comrades laughed. They weren't cruel. Laughter was survival. A man could not dwell too long on death without cracking under its weight. So they teased him for his Frankenstein rifle, for the tiny adjustments he made before every shot. But they also began to notice his calm, the way he sat for hours, motionless, his breath barely visible in the cold. They noticed how often his targets didn't move again. Inside Ivan's mind, the world was measured in angles and distances. He thought of each bullet not as violence, but as geometry: arcs, velocity, wind, gravity. The battlefield became a math problem written in smoke and blood. Every trigger pull was an answer. In those moments, he wasn't just surviving. He was restoring control in a world that had lost all sense of logic. Behind the calm exterior, though, lived exhaustion. The smell of oil and frost, the constant weight of frostbite creeping through his fingers. He wrote letters to his wife in Rostov, describing not the war, but the sound of metal, the way steel cracked under the cold, the click of the bolt, the silence between shots. It was the language of a man holding onto fragments of normal life through his craft. Kravchenko was not unique in that sense. Across the Eastern Front, millions were improvising survival. Some carved extra soles into their boots. Others turned shell casings into makeshift stoves. But few inventions had the precision or the quiet defiance of a homemade sniper scope that could blind a tank. His was an act of both necessity and rebellion, proof that the human mind, even in the depths of hell, still searched for perfection. In Stalingrad, a sniper's bullet wasn't just a weapon. It was communication. It told the enemy they were never safe. It froze entire platoons in place. It dictated the rhythm of battle in a way no artillery barrage could. The German Sixth Army had learned this painfully. Sniper fire turned every movement into a risk, every street crossing into a death sentence. For Soviet command, this invisible war became an essential tactic. Each marksman was assigned zones of observation, overlapping fields of fire that covered strategic choke points, intersections, supply alleys, and tank approach routes. Kravchenko's position near the Barricadi factory overlooked a wide expanse of open ground that German armor often used to reposition. His task was not to destroy tanks. That was for the anti-tank crews, but to disable them, disorient them, and demoralize those inside. The Red Army had long understood the power of psychological warfare. A single sniper could immobilize an entire enemy unit for hours. Every shot carried weight. A bullet through a tank commander's optics didn't just damage equipment, it shattered confidence. The crew inside would often abandon the vehicle, fearing ambush. Each time that happened, the Soviets gained ground without firing a shell. Ivan's field of fire was planned carefully. He and his spotter, a quiet soldier named Mikhail Gurevich, would study the terrain through periscopes made from polished glass and bent metal. They memorized where the tanks paused, how long they idled, where the sun's reflection betrayed movement. Then they would wait. Patience was their greatest weapon. Hours of stillness punctuated by seconds of thunder. Every sniper team in Stalingrad had its own rhythm. Some moved daily. Others never left their nests for weeks. Ivan and Mikhail followed the two-shot rule, never fire twice from the same position. After each engagement, they shifted by at least 50 meters, crawling through wreckage, setting up again, sometimes within earshot of their last kill. By late January, they had recorded over 40 confirmed strikes, most against infantry and light vehicles. But Ivan's ambition grew. He wanted to test his scope, to see if his design could strike a tank's vision port beyond conventional range. That desire wasn't arrogance. It was the pure instinct of a craftsman needing to prove his creation under the worst possible conditions. The opportunity would come soon enough. German tanks were regrouping for a desperate breakout attempt toward the Volga. The Soviets expected armor to move at dawn. Ivan prepared his rifle through the night, wiping condensation from the lens, aligning the reticle with the faint horizon glow. He checked his rangefinder twice, then whispered the numbers to Mikhail. Distance, wind direction, barometric pressure. When the first Panzer rolled into view at nearly 900 meters, it was more than a target. It was the ultimate test of man and machine, of human invention against mechanical superiority. The shot he was about to take would echo far beyond the frozen city. World War II was not only a war of men, it was a war of optics. From aerial reconnaissance lenses to tank periscopes, from submarine scopes to sniper sights, the ability to see farther and clearer defined power. The German war machine excelled in this realm, producing high-precision Zeiss optics that set the global standard. Their rifles, rangefinders, and tank sights combined engineering finesse with battlefield practicality. The Soviets, on the other hand, often compensated with quantity over refinement. Yet in Stalingrad, perfection was irrelevant. Function was all that mattered. Soviet engineers, deprived of resources, began to innovate through repurposing. Kravchenko's homemade scope was a product of this battlefield evolution, a child of necessity rather than industry. The foundation of his device was simple physics. He had scavenged two objective lenses from a damaged pair of German Zeiss binoculars. Using one as the main magnifier and the other inverted for focus correction, he created a crude magnification of roughly 3.5x. To stabilize it, he built a narrow brass tube from the casing of a broken compass. Its interior darkened with soot to reduce glare. The mounting rings were welded from wire and fitted to his Mosin Nagant 9130 rifle, secured with screws scavenged from a wrecked typewriter. What he achieved with that crude construction was remarkable. Despite the imperfections, slight lens warping, inconsistent alignment, limited light transmission, the scope provided just enough clarity for long-range engagement. The optical distortion was tolerable, and Kravchenko learned to compensate instinctively. He knew that the lower left quadrant of his sight dipped slightly. He adjusted his aim accordingly. His method wasn't unique, but his precision was. The Soviet front lines were scattered with improvised engineering. Mortars repaired with tractor parts, machine guns mounted on wheelbarrows, periscopes made from shattered mirrors. But few inventions demanded such a blend of craftsmanship, patience, and intimate understanding of geometry. A misaligned scope was worse than none at all. A mistake of a single degree could mean missing by several feet at 800 meters. The German side, meanwhile, continued to rely on industrial superiority. Their ZF-39 scopes, fitted to the Karabiner 98K, were masterpieces of clarity. But they were also expensive, fragile, and irreplaceable once lost in the rubble. Kravchenko's crude device could be rebuilt in hours from spare parts. In a war where every supply line was collapsing, simplicity became the truest form of sophistication. This shift, from precision manufacturing to field improvisation, was a silent revolution. It mirrored the broader Soviet doctrine of adaptation. The Red Army had learned that survival depended not on perfect machines, but on people who could fix them under fire. Kravchenko's scope was one of countless tiny innovations that together changed the face of warfare. It was a lesson that would outlive him. That technology is only as powerful as the human mind willing to bend it to purpose. War tests not only weapons, but also judgment. For Soviet commanders, the line between recklessness and innovation was razor-thin. Improvised devices could save lives, or fail catastrophically. When Kravchenko first demonstrated his modified rifle to his unit commander, Lieutenant Sergei Andropov, the officer reportedly shook his head. "You'll blow your own face off before hitting anything," he said. But the lieutenant allowed him to use it. In Stalingrad, refusal cost more lives than risk. Andropov wasn't alone in that mindset. The Soviet leadership, especially at the regimental and battalion level, had begun to reward initiative under constraint. If a soldier found a way to turn captured German equipment against its makers, he was encouraged. Stalin's infamous not one step back order had hardened the Soviet hierarchy. But beneath the rigidity, a culture of frontline innovation was taking shape. When Ivan's scope began to deliver results, confirmed hits at impossible distances, officers took notice. Some saw it as a symbol of Soviet ingenuity, others saw it as luck. But among his fellow snipers, it carried moral weight. It proved that courage could be engineered, that even a single soldier could invent something powerful enough to shift morale. Morale in Stalingrad was fragile. Food was scarce, frostbite rampant, and every sunrise felt like defiance rather than hope. Small victories mattered more than strategy. When Kravchenko disabled his first tank by shattering its viewing slit, the cheers echoed across the trench line. Word spread like fire. A homemade scope took down a Panzer. Soldiers who had once mocked him now asked to look through his sight, to glimpse the distant world it revealed. Commanders capitalized on the moment. They used the story in briefings, reminding soldiers that ingenuity was the ultimate weapon. It wasn't about tools, it was about resolve. In that sense, Ivan's invention became more than a sniper's aid. It became a message. The mind of one determined man could equal the industry of a nation. That moral transformation, however, came at a cost. The expectations placed upon him grew. He was now the unit's ghost marksman, sent to cover retreats, to silence machine gun nests, to halt advancing armor by striking where others couldn't. Each success raised the pressure for the next. His comrades looked to him as proof that even the most hopeless position could still yield victory. Kravchenko never asked for fame. He once told Mikhail, his spotter, that all he wanted was for the city to stop burning, for the smoke to clear long enough to see the river again. But war doesn't grant peace to the inventive. It only gives them harder targets. And one morning, as German armor regrouped near the silenced Red October factory, Ivan was given his hardest target yet, a Panzer IV at nearly a kilometer's distance, rolling through the frost toward the riverbank. That moment would test every calculation, every hour of work, and every doubt ever thrown his way. January 17th, 1943. Sevenhaven-Foyts. The sky above Stalingrad was a dull sheet of iron. The sun had not yet climbed past the smoke, and the city lay half-buried beneath frost and ash. Through the cracked windows of a ruined apartment block, Sergeant Ivan Kravchenko steadied his rifle on a broken windowsill. Beside him, Mikhail Gurevich crouched low, whispering distances through chattering teeth. 860 meters, Mikhail muttered, peering through a periscope made from scavenged glass. Wind from the northeast, 4 meters per second. Ivan nodded. His gloved hand brushed frost from the lens of his homemade scope. The glass fogged slightly, then cleared. The world beyond sharpened into a tunnel of focus. A white wasteland interrupted by a dark, lumbering silhouette. A Panzer IV, flanked by 2 infantry squads, was crawling across open ground near the Red October factory. Its treads churned through snow and rubble, its cannon angled forward like a spear. The Germans were making one final push toward the Volga. If they broke through this sector, they could open a corridor for retreat, or annihilate the Soviet positions holding them trapped. For Kravchenko, this wasn't just another target. This was proof. Proof that his crude invention could perform the impossible. He steadied his breath, letting his heartbeat slow until the pulse in his fingertips faded. Through the shaky glass, he saw the tank commander, a figure half exposed from the turret, scanning the horizon with binoculars. Ivan's mind began to calculate. Distance, 860 meters. Target height, 1.8 meters. Wind drift, 0.4 mils right. Bullet drop, 3.7 meters. He had memorized the ballistics of the 7.62 caliber 54mm cartridge like scripture. There was no room for guesswork now, Mikhail whispered again. Wait until it stops. The wind is shifting. The tank paused. Its gun turret turned slowly toward a cluster of ruined buildings further north. It had no idea 2 men watched it from the shadows. Ivan inhaled deeply, slow, steady, until his lungs filled with cold air that burned like glass. He held that breath, adjusted his aim by a hair's width, and exhaled halfway. The reticle settled on the narrow slit of the tank's commander's vision block, a rectangular glint of armored glass no wider than a few fingers. Then, silence. The world narrowed to the line between his eye and that sliver of glass. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared. The recoil jolted through his shoulder, echoing down the frozen hallway. The shell casing spun into the dust. Through the scope, the tank commander vanished from sight. A heartbeat later, the faint clang of impact carried through the cold. Not the dull thud of armor hit, but the brittle crack of glass shattering. Hit, Mikhail whispered. The Panzer halted. Its turret froze mid-turn. The infantry around it dropped flat, confused. Seconds stretched into eternity. The tank didn't move again. Then smoke began to drift from the open hatch. Not flame, but the acrid haze of panic. Inside the Panzer, chaos had erupted. The shot had pierced the optic housing and sent shards of glass inward, wounding the gunner's eye. In the claustrophobic dark, the crew scrambled to assess the damage, blind and deafened by their own fear. The commander slumped forward, struck in the face by fragments. His blood smeared the inside of the visor. Outside, The infantry hesitated, waiting for orders that would never come. Ivan chambered another round, keeping his breathing calm. He could see the driver's viewport now, a small black square beneath the turret. He waited again, the same patience that had defined every moment of his craft. The second shot was quicker, cleaner. It struck just below the visor, cracking the armor glass again. The tank shuddered, its engine revving once before stalling completely. For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of wind and the distant hammer of artillery. Then, a faint cheer rose from the Soviet trenches. Word traveled fast. The homemade scope did it. He hit the tank from 900 meters. Ivan lowered his rifle. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the release of it. Mikhail clapped him on the shoulder, grinning through frost-bitten lips. "You blinded it," he said. "You actually blinded the damn thing." The Panzer sat motionless, half submerged in the snow, its tracks still. Around it, German infantry withdrew under covering smoke. The Red Army held its ground. In that moment, the balance of ridicule and respect shifted forever. What had begun as a joke in the barracks became a legend whispered in the ruins of Stalingrad. The machinist who built his own eye, and through it saw farther than any man should have. But the battle was far from over. For every victory in Stalingrad, there was always another price waiting to be paid. And for Ivan Kravchenko, that price would come before the sun set on the same day. For a brief moment, Stalingrad seemed to pause. The thunder of artillery faded. The distant cries of infantry dulled. Every Soviet rifleman along the embankment turned their eyes toward the black shape of the crippled Panzer IV, now stranded in the snow. Its treads hissed, then stopped completely. Smoke bled slowly from the viewport, curling upward like a dying signal flare. In the trench lines below, the story spread faster than the echo of the shot itself. Soldiers shouted across ruined streets, "He hit it! The machinist hit the tank!" For weeks, despair had ruled this sector. Hunger, exhaustion, and the endless weight of winter pressing on every man's mind. But now, for the first time in days, laughter. Genuine laughter cut through the cold. Kravchenko didn't celebrate. His breath trembled as he pulled back the bolt and checked the chamber. The rifle felt heavier now, as if the weight of every eye on him had settled onto the stock. His hands were numb, but he worked the mechanism carefully, wiping frost from the homemade scope as though polishing glass in his old workshop. The same hands that once shaped machine parts now shaped the course of a battle. Mikhail watched him in silence. "They'll be talking about this for months," he whispered. Ivan's reply was quiet, almost lost to the wind. "Let them talk. We still have work." He was right. The Germans were reorganizing. 2 more tanks, Panzer IIIs, emerged from the smoke line, cautiously advancing to retrieve their damaged comrade. Infantry fanned out around them, firing bursts into windows, blind and desperate. The Soviets, heartened by the sight of the crippled tank, began to counterfire. Machine guns chattered from the upper floors, mortars boomed from basements, and the frozen city roared to life again. Ivan adjusted his rifle. The scope's lens had frosted slightly from the heat of the last shot. He rubbed it clean with the corner of his scarf. Through the imperfect glass, the world was blurred but still legible. Motion, distance, light. The second tank halted just short of the wrecked Panzer IV. Ivan could see the commander gesturing frantically, ordering his crew to pivot the turret toward the suspected sniper position. "Down!" Mikhail hissed, dragging him behind the window frame as a shell tore through the building's upper floor. Debris rained down. The wall shuddered but held. Ivan coughed dust from his lungs, eyes watering. When the smoke cleared, he looked again. Calm, deliberate. The tank had fired too high. Its gunner was guessing. Through the scope, he saw the shimmer of heat from the Panzer's exhaust, and the glint of sunlight on its optical sight. He adjusted elevation and windage. 1 click left, 2 down. He inhaled deeply, his pulse steady now, the chaos around him fading into the background hum of discipline. The reticle centered once more, this time on the enemy's gunner's periscope. The rifle cracked. A flash of sparks danced across the Panzer's face. Another crack appeared in the optic slit. The tank hesitated. Its turret stopped moving. Then, impossibly, it began to reverse, retreating into the smoke, abandoning the wreck of the first. The Germans were pulling back. To the Soviet infantry watching from the trenches, it looked like something out of legend. 1 man and 1 rifle stopping 2 tanks without a single shell. For Kravchenko's unit, the psychological shift was immediate. Men who had been slumped against walls moments before now stood taller. Commanders shouted orders with renewed strength. The front line, for the first time in days, began to advance. Reports later recorded the engagement as a precision strike disabling 2 enemy armored vehicles at extreme range. But among soldiers, it became something else, a myth born from exhaustion and awe. They spoke of the ghost machinist, the man who saw through steel. Ivan didn't hear most of it. As dusk fell over the city, he and Mikhail relocated to a new position. The temperature dropped sharply, and their breaths formed plumes of white in the fading light. He unscrewed the scope carefully, wiping condensation from the lens. Maybe now they'll stop laughing, Mikhail said softly. Ivan smiled faintly. Laughter kept them alive. Let them laugh again. He placed the scope in his pocket, not as a trophy, but as a tool still needed. There would be other tanks, other days, and no time for pride. Yet somewhere deep within him, the old machinist felt a quiet vindication. The work of his hands had changed something far larger than he ever imagined. Outside, the Panzer still burned faintly against the snow, a black silhouette glowing orange in the twilight. The sky over Stalingrad rumbled with distant thunder, artillery rolling like a storm across the steppe. And in that light, 1 man's act of invention, once mocked, once doubted, had turned the tide of belief for an entire unit. The city was not yet won, but its defenders had remembered what victory might feel like. The day after the shot, the battlefield was eerily quiet. The burned shell of the Panzer IV still lay half buried in snow near the Red October factory, its optics shattered, its commander dead inside. The German retreat from that sector was small in scale, but vast in meaning. For the men who held the frozen front, it was proof that even giants could fall. By dawn, word of the impossible shot had reached the regimental command post. Officers debated whether to believe it. A homemade scope, a single rifle, and a hit at nearly 900 meters against armor? It sounded like rumor, yet the evidence was undeniable. The tank still sat there, motionless, its viewports shattered in perfect alignment with the sniper's nest. That morning, Lieutenant Andropov summoned Kravchenko and Mikhail to headquarters. They arrived mud-streaked and silent, their rifles wrapped in burlap. The lieutenant studied the weapon for a long time, turning the crude scope over in his hands. He saw the brass casing, the rough welds, the fogging inside the lens. It looked like something from a village workshop, not a battlefield. And yet, it had worked. "You built this yourself?" Andropov asked. "Yes, Comrade Lieutenant," Ivan replied. From what was left, the officer said nothing for a while. Then, without looking up, he said quietly, "You've done what our factories couldn't." That single sentence carried more weight than any medal. In a war where failure was punished harshly and success often forgotten, acknowledgement from a superior was a form of survival. Within days, news of the incident reached front command. Kravchenko was recommended for commendation, not for marksmanship, but for technical ingenuity under combat conditions. The document described the event in cold military language. By personal initiative, Sergeant Kravchenko modified a standard-issue Mosin Nagant rifle with optical components salvaged from enemy equipment. The resulting device enabled effective fire at extended range, disabling enemy armor and preventing further advance. But among soldiers, the story grew larger than any report. They began to refer to him simply as the engineer. Some claimed he could see through walls. Others said he could hit a man's buttons from half a mile away. Rumor in war is both shield and burden. Kravchenko accepted neither praise nor myth. He continued his duty. Same rifle, same focus, same silence. The Red Army's morale in the sector rose sharply after the event. Commanders noted increased aggressiveness among infantry patrols, renewed confidence in ambush tactics, and fewer desertions. Psychologically, the notion that one man with a homemade tool could outwit German armor was revolutionary. It reinforced what the Soviet propaganda machine had been struggling to instill, that intelligence and endurance could overcome technology. Still, the reality of war left little room for legends. The German Sixth Army was collapsing. Paulus's forces, surrounded and starving, were running out of food, ammunition, and hope. Soviet artillery now fired almost without interruption. The siege tightened with each passing day. For Kravchenko's unit, the engagement with the Panzer was soon followed by relentless urban skirmishes. He fought on, his scope scratched and frostbitten, its lenses sometimes clouding from gunpowder residue. He kept cleaning, recalibrating, firing. Between battles, he helped fellow snipers repair their rifles, teaching them how to align optics with makeshift tools. What had begun as one man's desperate improvisation became a small but vital innovation shared across multiple sniper teams. By late January, as German resistance crumbled, Soviet units began to advance house by house toward the river. Ivan's position was moved forward. Each step brought them closer to victory, and to the end of the long, frozen nightmare that had consumed half a year. But history rarely pauses to honor the individual. The machinist who built his own scope faded back into the ranks, one of many who had endured and adapted. His rifle remained in service, its crude sight a relic of necessity, a symbol of invention under fire. In Stalingrad's silence after the storm, that spirit, the will to see farther than fear, became part of the city's soul. When the Battle of Stalingrad finally ended on February 13, 1943, it marked not just a Soviet victory, but the psychological turning of the entire Second World War. The surrender of the German Sixth Army, 91,000 men marching into captivity, signaled the first real fracture in Hitler's vision of invincibility. Among the shattered ruins and the frozen corpses, stories like Ivan Kravchenko's were buried beneath the larger triumph. Yet they represented the same truth. Human ingenuity had outlasted industrial dominance. In the months that followed, the Soviet High Command began to compile reports on equipment and tactics that had proved unexpectedly effective. Sniper units were singled out for their precision and morale impact. Within those reports were notes on improvised optical enhancements, particularly in frontline engagements where standard scopes were unavailable. Commanders described makeshift sights built from binoculars, periscopes, and camera lenses, inventions born from desperation. Kravchenko's name appeared in a single margin annotation: successful long-range engagement using modified optical tube. Results verified by field command. Though modest in official record, the implications were immense. His field innovation reflected a wider transformation, the Soviet military's realization that adaptability could be formalized. In the following year, the Red Army launched programs to recover and refurbish captured German Zeiss optics for use on Mosin Nagant rifles. Engineers studied the captured glass and combined its design with Soviet durability. By 1944, an improved PU scope with tighter tolerances and better sealing became standard issue. This wasn't coincidence. It was evolution. The lesson of Stalingrad was clear. Perfection mattered less than persistence. A crude but working tool in the hands of a determined soldier was more valuable than a flawless machine that could not reach the front. Across Europe, similar patterns emerged. In Finland, veterans like Simo Heiha had already demonstrated that simplicity and discipline could outperform advanced weaponry. On the Western Front, Allied marksmen began to adopt hand-fitted scopes, often modifying them in the field for better zeroing. War had forced all sides to confront the same truth. Technology was nothing without the mind that guided it. For Soviet propaganda, stories like Kravchenko's were small but potent symbols. Newspapers hinted at nameless engineer snipers, whose creativity mirrored the resilience of the Soviet people. The myth was no longer about the invincible soldier, but about the clever survivor. The worker in uniform who could adapt, build, and outthink his enemy. It was this ideal, not brute force, that would drive the Soviet war machine toward Berlin. After Stalingrad, Kravchenko was reassigned to a sniper training unit near Voronezh. His role shifted from hunter to teacher. There, he showed recruits how to zero scopes, how to steady their aim with breath instead of muscle, how to read wind through smoke rather than flags. He never spoke much about the Panzer engagement. When asked about his homemade scope, he would only say, "You build what you need, nothing more." The rifle itself eventually disappeared into history. Some say it was destroyed during a later offensive. Others claim it was taken back to Moscow as a curiosity, a relic of the siege. But the idea behind it, that necessity breeds innovation, remained embedded in Soviet doctrine for decades. The Red Army's later sniper manuals included sections on field modification and repair under combat conditions. Those instructions, improvised mounts, lens sealing with wax, calibration using shadow length, carried the quiet fingerprint of soldiers like Ivan. Men who had learned, under the weight of siege and starvation, that invention was not luxury, but duty. When historians later studied the technological evolution of W2 optics, they found a strange symmetry. The greatest advancements in precision often began in the most desperate conditions. The handmade scope that blinded a tank in Stalingrad was not an outlier. It was the embodiment of wartime truth. That even in the darkest winter, when machines failed and factories burned, the sharpest weapon left to humanity was still the mind. The city was quiet now. No artillery, no engines, just the slow breath of a frozen river beneath the ruins of Stalingrad. In the months that followed, the war would move west, to Kursk, to Berlin, to the end. But for Sergeant Ivan Kravchenko, it ended here, in the silence after a single shot that made the world take notice. He never called himself a hero. He didn't write his name in reports or pose for photographs. He simply packed his rifle, cleaned his lens, and went back to work. For him, survival was the only victory that mattered. Yet what he built in those ruins, that fragile, crooked scope, became something larger than survival. It became proof that even in a war built on factories and machines, the smallest act of invention could still tilt the balance between life and death. His story isn't about glory or fame. It's about vision, about a man who refused to accept that what he was given was all he could use. He didn't wait for permission. He built what he needed, with what he had. 80 years later, the weapons are different. The wars are different. But the truth he showed in that frozen city has never changed. Technology matters, but imagination decides. History remembers the generals and the victories, the tanks and the maps. But sometimes, history moves because of something quieter. One idea, one adjustment, one steady breath before the trigger breaks. Ivan's homemade scope is long gone now, rusted somewhere under Russian soil. But its message remains, because innovation doesn't start in laboratories or factories, it starts in moments of doubt, in laughter, from those who don't understand. In the silence that follows, when you prove them wrong, so when you think you don't have enough, not the tools, not the support, not the belief. Remember the machinist who built his own way to see through the smoke. He didn't change history by chance. He changed it because he refused to stop building, even when no one believed he could. And maybe that's the same kind of courage the world still needs, to see farther than fear and to create, even in the ruins.